This morning the topic is, what is a healthy church? And we are actually going to spend today and tomorrow and Friday morning discussing this topic. I've cut it in 3 sections. And we'll see how we go, where we end up today, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end of this meeting. So what is a healthy church? Using the word health, we may wonder, what is health? Now, the World Health Organization has given a definition of what is physical health. And their definition is, it is not just an absence of sickness, but it is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I think that is very much in line with what has always been the definition of health from an Adventist perspective. When we are speaking of the health of the church, I would suggest that we use health in a somewhat similar way. We're not just looking at the absence of big problems, the absence of controversy or fighting. No, what makes a healthy church? What makes it a place where everybody has a feeling of spiritual well-being? I read an interesting book about healthy congregations by Mr. Peter L. Steinke. And he says, he underlines this, that health of a church that really encompasses everything. And he calls for a systemic approach to the topic. A church is an organization. It's a social institution. It's more than that, but it is also a social institution. And so do the normal laws that apply to organizations, do they also apply to churches? In organizations, you often have cycles. You have periods when it goes well, and you have periods when it does not go so well. Organizations tend to appear, tend to have a time of prosperity, and then many organizations gradually die out again. The question is, does that kind of phenomenon also apply to churches, to denominations? There is a sociologist of religion, David O. Moberg, and whenever I talk about him, I check on Wikipedia whether he's still alive, because he's about 100. And the book that he wrote about this topic is now maybe 30 years old, but it's still a very significant publication about this type of thing. How is it with the church? Do these laws, these cycles, also apply to the church? And Moberg has studied many, many religious movements and churches. And he has come to the conclusion, yes, most denominations, most religious movements go through the same process. And he says there are about 5 phases, 5 stages through which every denomination that he has studied has gone. Let me see. He says there is stage 1. That is when it starts. He calls that the stage of incipient organization. You have some people who are dissatisfied with the existing organizations of which they are part. There are some new ideas arising on the part of some. And there are some leaders who have charismatic qualities, and they bring these few people together and they start thinking about what could be done. The state of incipient organization. Then he says there is, secondly, the stage of formal organization. These people who have these ideas, goals, and ideas take further shape. And there is a kind of consensus that develops among that group about beliefs, about ideals, about standards. And they begin a powerful recruitment. Can you see that that also happened in Seventh-day Adventism? That is what began, an incipient organization after the Miller debacle, and then the stage of formal organization, when things begin to take shape, and when there is a stage of strong recruitment. Then Moberg says, you reach a third stage, the stage of maximum efficiency. There are innovative activities. The leadership is now becoming less charismatic, more rational, because the movement grows, and that is necessary. There is a centralization of organization, and the organization likes to be recognized for what it is, likes to be known for what it is by society. The stage of maximum efficiency. And then David Moberg says there is the stage of institutionalization. When that movement becomes bigger, more complicated, there is a growing bureaucracy, norms and standards among the members relax to some extent, and there is a growing passivity among the members, because there is now an organization with paid employees, etc., who do the work. The stage of institutionalization. And then Moberg says there is stage 5, the stage of disintegration. Formalism, red tape, he calls it, even corruption. The administration does not relate anymore to current questions and current issues. There is a loss of trust in leaders. New sects emerge at the margins, and that's end of story. Now, if you see that, and if you would apply that to the Seventh-day Adventist Church worldwide, where are we? Are we in stage 3 of maximum efficiency? Or are we perhaps in stage 4 of institutionalization? Or could it be that in some places we are at stage 5, formalism, red tape, bureaucracy, loss of trust in leaders, new sects emerging at the margins? Have you noticed how many independent ministries with their own ideas are emerging at the margins of the church? Does that mean that this is end of story? Now, I would suggest that there is the danger that in some parts of the world our church is in stage 4 or stage 5. There are fortunately many parts of the world where we are in stage 3. Because then the question is this a prophecy? Must this always happen? Or is it a warning? Now, I would say it's a warning. When you consider that this is the normal process that happens in most religious movements, and you see some of the phenomena, some of the things that Moberg alluded to, you see some of these things also in our church at different level, then it's time to be awake and say, let's make sure that it will not be end of story. But it doesn't have to be a prophecy. One thing is sure, change, renewal is needed to safeguard that we will not end up at stage 5. Now, we want to avoid being in stage 5. We want to be a healthy church. If at all possible, we want to go to stage 3 again, where the church has its maximum in power and in energy. How do we look at health, a healthy church? Well, is it numerical size or positive growth patterns? No, we are very happy to report additions in membership. And sometimes Seventh-day Adventists have had an obsession with numbers. We come to realize gradually that numbers can be very deceptive. That we can baptize 10,000 people, but the question is how many of those are still there 5 years from now? And so we have to be careful to measure health in terms of numbers. You know, when numbers go down, as they do in some places in the world, or they would do if there were no migration patterns, and that's true for quite a few places in Europe, where membership would have gone down had it not been for the fact that people have come from elsewhere. That's true, for instance, in my country, the Netherlands. We have had influxes from Indonesia, from Suriname, from Curacao, and nowadays many from Africa and South America. And so about probably 50% of the church has come from elsewhere. And that has meant that the church has grown in numbers. And we're happy for that, but to some extent it is deceptive, because it has remained or become ever more difficult to bring people to the church who look somewhat like me. Maybe some of you have been in London, and you go to church in London. There are many churches in London. I don't know how many, but there must be 50 or 60 at least. But in the greater London area, where we may have 4 to 5 or maybe even more thousand members, there are still about 100 members who are what you might call indigenous British people. Everybody else is immigrant. We're happy that the church has grown, but numbers can be very deceptive as to what is actually happening. And sometimes when the numbers go down, we don't speak of loss, but we speak of negative growth. That sounds better, doesn't it? Okay, does health have to do with economic prosperity? We are known in many parts of the world as the rich church. Now, maybe we don't recognize that as much ourselves here in the Western world, that we are that rich, but you know, in many places in Africa, the missionaries that come from the Adventist church are much better off than many missionaries from other churches. Because we have a support system that is wonderful. But let's not be deceived and not measure health in terms of economic prosperity or in terms of institution building. Now, there is a temptation to do that. And we brag about the number of hospitals and the number of schools and the numbers of this and that. Very good. It's a blessing to have them. But that does not necessarily mean that the church is healthy. When we have a prestigious history, we talk about all the great things of the past. Great, but that does not necessarily mean that the church is healthy today. Or when we are recognized nationally and internationally, that's nice, but it does not necessarily mean that we are healthy. So, the health of the church. Must remember, the church is more than a human institution. It's more than just an organization. It's more than maybe something that Moberg can measure with his model. Christ is the founder of the church. He is the head of the church, and he must be the focus of the church. And so the concept of health must be based on a sound concept of the church. Theologians call that ecclesiology, a sound concept of the church. Some basic principles. The church, as we saw yesterday, transcends man-made boundaries. We are part of God's visible church, but there is also God's invisible church. And we must be careful, as we saw yesterday, to say who really belongs to the flock that Jesus Christ has on this earth and who does not. And we must remember a principle that was uttered by Martin Luther first, that the church consists at the same time of saints and sinners. That doesn't mean that these are the saints and those are the sinners. It means that all of us, we are sinners, but at the same time we may call ourselves saints, sanctified by Jesus Christ, belonging to him, belonging to that holy nation. Another basic principle is, when we talk about the church, we must not just talk about the church as a global organization or as a union-wide or conference-wide organization. But first of all, the church is local. That's the basis. And so that's from where we start. Now, yesterday also, and I'll just repeat that just very briefly, we talked about the different marks of the church. And we said that it has always been recognized that the church consists, or has rather, 4 different marks. It's holiness, it's unity, it's Catholicity, it's general, it's everywhere, and it's apostolicity. Right. You know, there are these words that break your tongue sometimes. Okay. Being rooted in the message of the apostles, how they proclaimed Jesus Christ in their days. So, what is a healthy church? What is the essence of the church according to Luther and Calvin, the great reformers? They said you can only have a healthy church when there is a faithful preaching of the word and a proper administration of the sacraments. Those are the 2 things for the 2 great reformers. Zwingli, the 3rd reformer, agreed, although he had a different view of the Lord's Supper altogether. And then you had the Radical Reformation, who emphasized the need for believers' baptism, whereas Luther and Calvin still held on to infant baptism. The Radical Reformers said, no, that is not what the Bible teaches, but to be part of the true church, you need to be baptized in the biblical way. Now, Adventists, we have undergone influences from lots of different groups. The early Adventist pioneers, they came from different churches, from different religious backgrounds. And inevitably, of course, they brought some of their inheritance with them. And so we have influences, certainly at the beginning, that made Adventism to what it was and is, from the Reformers, ideas from people like Calvin in particular. We have had influences from the so-called radical reformers, the baptism by immersion of adults, which was carried on by some denominations and brought to the United States. There were major influences of Methodism. Ellen White and several others of the early pioneers were Methodists before they became Adventists. Now, some of you have been maybe Roman Catholic, some have maybe Baptist or whatever before you became a Seventh-day Adventist. And you can never shed that completely. That influences your life. You bring some things with you. And it was no different at that time. Have you ever wondered why we have the Lord's Supper every 3 months? Why is that? Where is that in the Bible that you should have the Lord's Supper every 3 months? Please quote me a text.
Where is it in the Bible that you've got to burn the bread and tip the wine down the seat? Perfectly good, healthy food.
Okay. The Methodists were very numerous in the area where Adventism originated. And they had a particular type of way of doing things. They had people who were called the circuit riders. Men, yes, men, not women, men, who had their horses, and they went through the different Methodist groups in their circuit, in their district. And it was so organized that they had about 13 different groups in their circuit. And they each week would be in a different group. And when they were in that group, they would have the Lord's Supper, and the next day they would have a business meeting, also once every 3 months, right? That was something that we simply adopted. We thought that was a good idea, and so that has continued in most places until today. Simply something that we have borrowed. Well, when you think of Sabbath school, that is something we have borrowed. We have adapted it, we have changed it, but there was a Sunday school system in many churches in the 19th century that was very similar to the kind of Sabbath school system that we adopted. So there's nothing wrong with that, to pick and choose and adapt, as long as it is biblically, at least, not prohibited, but in harmony with biblical principles. Now, there was also a group called Christian Connection. James White and some other leaders were members of the Christian Connection before they became Seventh-day Adventist. They said that we should not have a creed, we should not have a list of fundamental beliefs. And for a very long time, that was what our church said. We should not have a list of fundamental beliefs. Well, it's a long story how that changed. But the Christian Connection also did not believe in the Trinity. And some of the people who came out of that context, they did not believe in the Trinity. And it took quite a while for the Seventh-day Adventist Church to come to the point that we would accept the doctrine of the Trinity, of 3 co-equal persons in the Godhead. Today we find here and there people who say we must go back to the teachings of the pioneers. Well, some of the pioneers, they did not believe in the Trinity. Whether that is a reason to go back to that, that's another story again. But so, Adventists have often adopted, borrowed from others. Now, to come to a healthy church, and I see that my time is going, so I'll make a little bit more speed. How many criteria are there if you want to come to a healthy church? Google a bit and put in criteria healthy church, and you find that there are numerous books written about that topic. And you find different lists by different authors. And often there is a lot of overlap. 2 examples here, very worthwhile to read. A book, 9 Marks of a Healthy Church by Mark Deffer, and Healthy Church's Handbook by Robert Warren. Deffer says that the marks, the criteria of a healthy church are expositional preaching, biblical theology, biblical understanding of the gospel, biblical view of conversion, biblical view of evangelism, biblical view of membership, a biblical view of discipline, of discipleship, and of church leadership. Well, that's a good list. And the book is worthwhile reading. Robert Warren says, a healthy church has a passion for the Christian faith, is outward looking, is searching for God's will, dares to change, wants to be a genuine community where there is space for all, and will concentrate on a few tasks that they can do well, rather than to try to do everything well. That is impossible because of manpower, etc., etc. So, and I could cite other books and give you other lists. Now, I've given quite a bit of thought to this topic, and over the years, my thoughts have, I hope, matured a little bit. And I'm going to give you today and tomorrow and day after tomorrow my list. Do with it what you want. But maybe there are a few things that you like, maybe there are a few things that you would like to think about a little further. For me, the 10 criteria for a healthy church, which I will develop a little further. A healthy church must be truth-based. It must avoid what I have called toxic faith. Those are the 2 topics we'll deal with in the remainder of this morning. And then tomorrow and Friday, a healthy church must be clear about its identity. It must be clear about its task. It must have a concern for justice. And then, and that's probably Friday, it must have high ethical standards. A kind of governance that is based on principles. It must display unity in diversity. And I'm going to emphasize that unity, yes, but diversity is also important. It must display true spirituality and must have a willingness to change. Now again, if you would like to have this PowerPoint, just send me an email and I'll be happy to share it with you. Truth. The first criteria for a healthy church is that it must be based on truth. But what is truth? Truth in the first place is relational. You know, Christ said, I am the truth. Christ did not say that the biblical principles that you can list as fundamental beliefs, they are the truth. He says, I am the truth. To have a relationship with him, to be a child of him, that is to be in the truth. Now, I don't know whether you have this saying here, but in Europe, sometimes they ask you, how long have you been in the truth? Do they ask that here? And then, well, the answer that you are expected to give is, I have been a church member for so long. But being in the truth means being in Christ. But yes, it does also have what I have called propositional content. That is, you also believe something about Jesus Christ. When you believe in God, you say, I believe in God. Then, of course, the question is now, what kind of God do I believe in? Who is this God? What are his characteristics? What has he done for me? What does he expect of me? And so that's where we have theology, that's where we have doctrine. But we must never think that we have arrived at the full truth and there is nothing more to learn, because we must always remain a learning and a reforming community. The question is about truth. Is there objective truth? Now this maybe gets a little philosophical, but okay, bear with me. We live in an age of postmodernism. You've heard that term? And I'm not going to explain everything about postmodernism this morning. But one of the characteristics of the way of thinking of many people today, of postmodern thinking, is that I have my truth, Pastor Brett has his truth, you have your truth, and that's okay. And we do not necessarily have to agree, because we all just know a little bit. There is no big truth, capital T. But really, common sense demands that we talk and compare. And when he says A and I say B, it cannot be true at the same time. So we must search for more truth. Reason demands that we do. And some statements that contradict each other, they cannot be true at the same time. And so, although there are many questions that we might ask, and many questions that will not be answered, yet we must continue to search for truth, to what it is that we can say about our God, about salvation in Jesus Christ, about the presence of the Holy Spirit, about the church. We have developed doctrine when we speak about God, when we speak about the truth. Do we need doctrine? Some people say, no, we don't need doctrine. As long as we believe in Jesus Christ, hallelujah, praise the Lord, that's all we need. Well, you know, doctrines help us to talk about our faith. I'd like to compare it with the role of grammar in a language. Now, grammar is not the same as language. Language is more important than maybe grammar, but you need grammar in order to be able to communicate, to give structure to your language. You may still make some grammatical mistakes, as I do when I speak another language, and sometimes even when I speak my own language, but still there is the structure to my language so that I can communicate. And you might compare that to the role of doctrine. Doctrine is not the same as faith. But if you want to think about your faith, if you want to talk about your faith, their doctrine becomes a tool. It gives structure to our speaking about God and our faith. Okay. At the same time, when we speak about doctrine, we should never think that doctrine is a finished product. that we now know everything there is to know about God, and you can put that in a number of fundamental beliefs, and that's it forever. For one thing, doctrine is a human product. Christ is the truth. But what we say about the truth comes from a human perspective. And there are always things that we could say better, or maybe things that we could say differently, or maybe things that in the future we have to correct. Now, I don't know whether you have looked at the fundamental beliefs that we have in our church recently, but there is a preamble. Now, sometimes we leave that out, but it's a very important part of the statement, the preamble that says, this is how at this point in time we think we can formulate best what we believe. But there may be a time when we need other words, other ideas to express it better. So doctrine is always somewhat in a flux. It should never be something that we consider on a par with truth. It expresses truth as best as we humanly can, but it is different from what truth, capital T, is. So we must always be growing in our understanding of truth. And I firmly believe we must also be allowing for differences in our understanding. Do you still believe in exactly the same way as you did 25 years ago? I hope you don't. We must all be growing in our faith and in our understanding of our faith. So, then, and I want to speak about this before we give time for questions and answers. Well, maybe answers, questions at least. The second criteria, first criteria then, truth-based. The second criteria, that we have a healthy faith rather than a toxic faith. And I have listed here some of the dangers to avoid. Now here it can easily become a bit controversial. And I don't want to do that, but I believe fundamentalism is a danger. Of course, it depends on what you think fundamentalism is. But fundamentalism is usually understood as being a very literal reading of the Bible and a very strict application without taking the context into consideration. Now, our church has always insisted that it is not fundamentalist. In fact, fundamentalism as we know it today did not exist when the Adventist Church originated. Fundamentalism, and the very term comes from the early 20th century. Around 1920, 1925, in many of the churches in North America, there was a trend which was called modernism, liberalism. And there was a group of scholars at one of the American university, Princeton University, that decided that something had to be done. And they decided to write a number of brochures. And they called those brochures the fundamentals. And these became quite popular, also within Adventism. One of the key ideas was verbal inspiration and the inerrancy of the Bible. Verbal inspiration, what does that mean? That means that every single word of the Bible is inspired. It is more or less dictated by God to the Bible writers. Well, of course, it is recognized that that would have been in the original languages. It's not that the King James, although some people feel that the King James Version is almost verbally inspired as well. But that idea that it was verbally inspired. That was foreign to original Seventh-day Adventism. When you look at what Ellen White said on that topic, she is quite clear that she did not believe in verbal inspiration. She said that the people who wrote the Bible were God's penmen and not his pen. And they wrote with their own style, with their own vocabulary, as best as they could. She's very clear about that. Read the introduction to the Great Controversy. Read also the statement about inspiration in the early part of the first volume of Selected Messages. But somehow today there is a tendency in many parts of the church to go to that kind of Bible reading of that I call fundamentalist. Some call it the plain reading of the Bible. You take everything literal. Now, the problem with that approach is, of course, that people who do that are always very selective. So when somebody comes to me and say, you must take this literal, then I ask them, do you believe that the earth is flat? And they say, no, of course not. Well, you have to believe that the earth is flat if you take everything literal, because the earth has 4 corners. Now, you know, a globe doesn't have corners. It's only a flat plane that has corners. Then they say, well, come on. Well, but that still is the problem. Plain reading, people select what they take literally, and other things they do not take as literal. And this has some bearing on some of the major issues in the Seventh-day Adventist Church today. For instance, women's ordination, you know, taking some text literal and other text not literal. Taking the text literal where it speaks about women who should remain silent in church and ask their husbands when they are home. You know, so I hope no woman is going to ask a question to me. You ask your husband, you know, when you're in your tent. That is the biblical way. If you take it literal. But then in the very same chapter, it talks about slavery. And then the same people who take one text literal do not take the other text literal. No, that's not for us. So, well, we could go on and on about this topic, but I think we have to be careful in the way we read the Bible, have a balanced approach to the Bible. And that is something that, unfortunately, I think is lacking quite a bit. Another danger, legalism. That has always been a problem for us. And it's understandable. We had to defend ourselves to the outside world. People were always attacking us. Why do you keep the Sabbath? Why do you do this? Why don't you eat pork? And we had to explain that. And we came across as people who were a people of rules, of do's and don'ts. But we have to admit that we have often given people the, let's say, the justification for thinking that, because legalism has been an enormous problem in Seventh-day Adventism, and is that today. In particular, when we think of the idea of this last generation theology that is quite popular in many places around the world, where the idea is that before Christ will come, there will be a perfect generation. And of course, if you want to be perfect, then you have to really look at the rules that you keep, and it can become quite obsessive. Now, there's no time this morning to explore all these things, but when we look at a healthy faith, we need to be aware of some of these things and make sure that they do not take over our thinking. You know, another thing that I think is very unhelpful, and that is what is called conspiracy thinking. You know, we must be aware of the things that are happening in the world, and there are things happening that we don't see, and many dangers are lurking. But we should not see a Jesuit behind every bush. And we should not always be thinking in terms of conspiracies. Now, there are some speakers that are in the church, have DVDs that are widespread, and have a lot of this conspiracy thinking. Ask yourself, when you look at them, when you listen to them, how much gospel is there really? Because that is the criteria. That we are not getting involved in all kinds of conspiracy thinking, but we remain focused on Jesus Christ and our relationship to him. Well, there are other things that I would call toxic. Adoration of tradition and rituals, an imbalance between mind and emotions, or pride, personal or collective. A healthy faith, a healthy church is needed if we want to avoid that scenario that David Moberg painted. If we want to be a church with a future, in many ways we need renewal, we need change, we need to make sure that we're always truth-based, a relationship to Jesus Christ, and that we avoid toxic elements in our faith. That's where I would like to leave it for this morning, and we'll continue with the other points tomorrow and the day after tomorrow.